there's so much resonance between what I think is true and the kinds of things Jesus said. Right. My issue with organized religion, every organized religion, is just that
I declare parlay.
I declare bankruptcy!
What up, everybody? Nate Sala here, back with a brand new video. Now, some of you are like, when are you going to do more debate stuff in evangelism? I absolutely am going to do that, but there's just something about the conversations that Jordan Peterson is having right now that holds the interest of a lot of people, and I think rightly so, for good reason. I think we truly benefit from wrestling with these conversations, with what they mean, with how we should respond, especially as Christians. So I did a Jordan Peterson reaction to his conversation with Joe Rogan about the Bible, but now, looky here. Peterson just spoke to Sam Harris on his podcast, so literally a few days ago. So let's just go ahead and do one more spin on the merry-go-round, shall we?
So I was standing with my wife the other day on the dock of this cottage we have up north, and it's very dark up here. And so when you look up, you can see the night sky well enough to see the Milky Way, and actually to see galaxies if you use the corner of your eye. And one of the things that's associated with that is an experience of awe. And it's not surprising, because there you are confronting what's essentially infinite, as far as you're concerned, as much as it might be for us. And I
hate to step in so quickly, but I hope that if that's where we're going here, we're going to talk about awe, that we define it. That we define it and perhaps identify where that comes from and what its function is designed for, right? That from both a Christian and non-Christian perspective, I think that would be a fascinating topic of conversation.
Thought a lot about the experience of awe. One of the things, and it's also produced by music quite regularly, one of the things that happens when you experience awe is that a vestigial piloerection mechanism kicks in. And that's the mechanism that makes prey animals puff up. You see this with cats. They're quite funny when they do this. They puff up so they look bigger in this when they catch sight of a threatening predator, and so they perhaps subjectively experience the more terror-stricken end of awe. But that awe is very, very deep. It's not a rational response. It's way underneath rationality. It's an instinctual response, and it seems to me as well that it's associated very tightly with our instinct to imitate. And it's strange to think that you could look at the night sky and that could catalyze an instinct to imitate. But we're very good at using abstraction, us creatures, and it's not exactly obvious what we can imitate and what we can't. So I think that's an example of this idea that you're putting forward, that the domain of religious experience, let's say, or spiritual experience, has a biological underpinning, a deep biological underpinning. And part of my question is, what are the implications of that exactly, if that happens to be the case? So
right, and there it is, and it's a great question. What are the implications of this feeling or sense of awe? Because it appears to be ingrained in our very biology. Well, it seems to me that there are two ways to go here, right? You either turn inward for the answer or you turn outward. The non-Christian turns inward and the Christian turns outward. If you turn inward, then you'd probably say something like, well, the feeling of awe originates out of our biology as some kind of byproduct, some kind of reaction to the world around us. But the location of the experience never leaks out or connects to something transcendent out there, outside of our own selves. It's locked inside us so that the full essence of our experience is all taking place inside ourselves. It never originates from the outside. It never transcends. We're just having a physiological reaction of sorts. Okay, if you turn outward, you would probably say something like, awe is the soul resonating with something, not inside ourselves, but something out there. There is a thread of our experience that breaks through the wall of ourselves and connects to something real that is on the outside. But see, this requires that there is something about us that is not material and can sense that connection with something else that is not material outside of ourselves, which is God. And by the way, Christians have a word for this connection. It's called prayer. But somebody might push back and say, well, wait a second, Nate, you're already starting out with an immaterial soul. You're already starting out with a spiritual dimension to reality. Okay, fair enough. But the critic is doing the same thing, right? They're starting out with no soul, and they're starting out with no spiritual dimension to reality. That's their starting point. So I guess what I'm getting at is, let's talk about starting points, because that's the root of the issue here. That's how we can get to it. Because if we don't do that, we're probably going to hear a wonderfully eloquent conversation about looking inward as if that's the only explanation for awe.
First, I'd like to know if you agree about that discussion about awe and the is and ought thing, and then anything else you'd like to add, I'd like to hear.
Yeah, well, you've opened many doors there. I see a 10-hour conversation, but treating just those topics. But, to start with the is ought bit, yeah, but you're in very good company. Most people in science and philosophy, as you know, believe there really is a disjunction between is and ought. And to follow Hume's really cast aside remarks, I mean, he didn't go into it deeply, but at one point he wrote that you can't derive an ought from an is, right? There's no description of the way the world is that can tell you how it ought to be. So, and he was decrying the fact that so many scholars and in general so many theologians in his time would move smoothly from is to ought without acknowledging that they had committed a logical error. But I do think there's a trick of language lurking at the bottom of this is and ought talk that is misleading.
I've mentioned this before, but it bears repeating. When you're having a conversation with someone about Christianity, religion, atheism, metaphysics, you know what I mean? Whatever it is, and you ask questions to seek to understand someone, maybe also you're trying to identify points of disagreement, it's really a bad idea to ask more than one question. To ask even perhaps a multifaceted question. Why is that the case? It's because the person that you're talking to probably won't remember everything you ask. All right? And then consequently, you won't get an answer for everything that you asked. And now look what's happening here. Harris isn't answering the question about awe. He's focused on the is-ought problem.
And it's difficult to spot. And, I believe I've spotted it. But I the people who don't agree with me. I mean, their intuitions don't pass through, the point where I'm trying to shove them. And, it's somewhat analogous to, the philosopher Wittgenstein made a point when he was criticizing Freud. He was criticizing Freud's notion of the unconscious. He thought this reification of the unconscious was fallacious. And, we can leave that aside. I'm not sure I agree with him there, but the point he was making about the power of language was interesting. He said, imagine if instead of saying, I saw nobody in the room, we said, I saw Mr. Nobody in the room. Imagine a language that forced us to say, I saw Mr. Nobody, right? Just imagine what confusion would be born of that convention of language. That's something he said in his, I think it was in the Blue Book. And there are many places in our thinking about the world where language plays a similarly confusing role, where we have reified something which is not...
Probably happens with free will.
Yeah, no, so I think it's confused us about free will. It's confused us about death, for instance. I mean, I think...
That's an interesting little aside there. What do they mean by that? Are they suggesting that we reify certain aspects of our freedom that don't really exist, like in terms of ability or capacity? So what's underneath that? Are we talking about compatibilism here? Are Peterson and Harris compatibilists? Is that what's going on here? I mean, it makes sense for someone like Harris to be a compatibilist. I mean, based on the things that he has said. But what about Peterson?
If you're an atheist who doesn't believe that anything happens after you die, right? If you think there's no rebirth, there's no reincarnation, and that Eastern picture of karma and rebirth is probably not true, and you think there's no heaven or hell, and if you really think you get something like a dial tone when you die, well, many people are left expecting some kind of oblivion, some kind of positive nothingness, some permanent loss of experience. And so this notion of oblivion is a kind of reification But if you think about it more clearly, that's precisely the kind of thing you would not. I mean, if it's simply the end of experience, well, then you're not going to be experiencing the end of experience, right? This is not. You, you didn't experience an absence before you were born,
right? Well, the idea that
so when Harris talks about reification, as far as I understand the term, he means taking something that is completely abstract and making it real. And I take it he means making something real that should not be real. So when we talk about like experiencing nothingness, or however he said it a second ago, we're talking about something that can't be experienced because nothingness is the state of non-being. And experience trades on being, right? So when we talk about this, it seems like we've made nothingness into something concrete when it isn't. That's what it seems like he's suggesting is going on with issues like the is-ought problem. Although I think he needs to do some more work to make the connection more clear there.
you would experience is implicit in the way the question is framed.
Right. So there's nothing you're going to suffer. I mean, this is something that Epicurus pointed out through Lucretius, that death is nothing for us. Where we are, death is not, and where death is, we are not. Right? Like they're just non-overlapping sets of facts, whatever those facts are. If in fact death is the end of experience, so which is to say, there's nothing to worry about really. If death is just the end of anything.
That's a big if.
And so, how do you think that relates to the is-ought problem?
Yeah. So to come back to is and ought, I just think. Really what we have, I mean, forget about morality, forget about questions of good and evil, forget about any value judgment. And try to return your mind to something like the primal circumstance of consciousness, right? I mean, just imagine waking up from, a 100-year sleep, and you've forgotten everything about yourself, and now you're just a mind in a world. In some sense, we're all potentially in that position in every moment in our lives, just seeing creation afresh, right? Seeing this moment of seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, thinking as though for the first time, clearly.
Do you know that? Have you ever heard of the neurological case? I think it was a man who had bilateral hippocampal damage, and he was in a psychiatric hospital, and he woke up like that every second.
Yeah,
his wife would come in the room and he'd say, "It's as if I'm seeing you for the first time." He lost that.
Right.
He lost the imposition of memory on his perception, and so every perception was fresh and new.
Yeah. Well, and I'm not recommending brain damage to anyone as a way of freshening up experience, but there's a non-neurologically compromised way of grasping this intuition, which is just in this moment. Experience really is potentially totally fresh and totally new, and but for the fact there's this ever-present layer of our thinking about it, our remembering what just happened, our expecting the next thing that's going to happen. And it's really the conversation we're having with ourselves in each moment, and meditation is a way of breaking that spell and actually being vividly aware of the present moment in a way that frees you from this automaticity of viewing everything through your concepts and your discursiveness.
There's something about this that's very Buddhist. I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but I was taken with Buddhism before becoming a Christian myself. And so there's a philosophy within Buddhism that sounds an awful lot like what Harris is saying here. But it's kind of fuzzy because there's a bit of a communication issue in that these guys are not speaking as directly as they could be, in my opinion. And that's just because they're on a whole other level of genius. You know what I mean? These guys are obviously very intelligent. I've met guys like this before. And when you're on that genius level, you tend to have your own kind of language. You know what I mean? But it sounds like Harris is saying the only thing that is real is what is. And anything else that we derive from that in terms of oughts is just, it's an attempt to reify what is. And I suppose if we wanted to be very Buddhist about this, I mean, I could take it even a step further than that and say that all of our suffering comes out of the enterprise of sort of responding in the wrong way, maybe misunderstanding in some deep sense what is actually is, All of a sudden, I'm Bill Clinton.
It depends upon what the meaning of the word is.
I don't know Harris enough, but Do any of you know, like, is he friendly to Buddhism? Can somebody tell me that in the comments? Like, because he certainly sounds a bit like a Buddhist here.
That actually harkens back to the is-ought problem, right? Because right there you said, and I'm not denying the validity of anything you've said so far, but right there you said that without agreeing on the validity of evidence, let's say, there's no agreement about what is. And there we've got a frame problem there, right? We have that value that you need to even determine what is. Well, the question then is, well, where does that value come from? And you can't say, well, it comes from what is in some easy manner, because you just said, unless you have a value of a certain sort, you can't derive what is. And that's partly why this is-ought problem just doesn't seem to go away.
Yeah, but it goes away because it goes.
So, if I'm understanding what Peterson is trying to point out, this is why you, me, every single person needs to wrestle with what's called the problem of the Criterion. There's a great little book. You can get it by Roderick Chisholm. I'm a professional. I think I have it, actually. Yeah, look at this. Here's can everybody see this? The problem of the Criterion. It's a very tiny book. Like, it's not a big read, right? But you got to read it. You know, if you're going to keep up with this particular conversation and the issues that are going on here, you got to read that book, and then you got to reread it again. You know what I mean?
There is, in principle, always a mystery at our backs. You know, this is true experientially. I mean, I would say this is true experientially with respect to the nature of consciousness, but it's true conceptually with respect to even those fields that pretend to be most directly in contact with the nature of reality. I mean, so even physics, you know, when you're talking about the most rudimentary laws of physics, right, there has to be a first brute fact or a brute axiom that you accept that need not prove itself.
This is totally correct. Okay. But what are those brute facts that you take as your starting point to begin to shape your noetic structure? See, this touches on what Peterson was trying to explain to Joe Rogan, what was it, last week, about the Bible. We can reason very eloquently through lots of different things as thinking creatures, but we don't just begin with a tabula rasa. There is no such thing as a blank slate when it comes to beliefs. We have to start out with certain beliefs that we take for granted, or else we're just going to get lost in the endless requirement of justification for our beliefs. See, at some point in the enterprise of epistemology, you can't keep playing the game of based on what, right? Like, you can ask that question about any belief that you have. Based on what? What's that belief based on? Okay, what's that belief based on? But if you keep going and you never stop, you slip into a vicious regress. Like, if your thoughts were a plane, it would never be able to get off the runway. So at some point, you have to begin with some brute facts. Something that is axiomatic that you take for granted. That's just how this game works. And by the way, brute means there is no explanation needed, okay? This is what I was talking about, your starting point to begin the process of understanding the world around you. So when Sam Harris recognizes that, good for him. But the question is, what are his brute facts that comprise his starting point? Because his brute facts may be different than Jordan Peterson's brute facts, and they're definitely different than mine, as far as I can tell. So what are they?
Yeah, so there are two levels at which we can address this problem of thought and its connection to suffering. And one is at the level of thought itself, right? It's like you can replace bad thoughts with better thoughts, right? You can triangulate on your tendency to have one kind of conversation with yourself, and engineer a better conversation with yourself, right? And that's, in cognitive behavioral therapy.
You can stop thinking like a 6-year-old, for example, and start thinking like a 30-year-old.
Right. And what's more, a 30-year-old that actually has good intentions for you, right? Like you can, a friend, right? You can make your mind your friend.
Yeah, loved one even.
Yes, yeah. Can you imagine that? So
imagine that.
So that's a totally legitimate way to climb out of the great hole of suffering that people find themselves in.
Did you hear that? I don't know if you caught that. Harris said that your internal mental process is a totally legitimate method of climbing out of the hole of suffering, right? In one sense, a Christian can agree with that, okay? Because the Christian way of dealing with suffering is to bend the knee at the throne of God and ask him for strength to endure the suffering, ask him for perhaps release from the suffering if it be his will, and ask him for peace, right? And there's all kinds of biblical examples for this. Jesus, the night he was arrested and eventually crucified, asked the Father to let that cup pass from him, right? But Jesus said, nevertheless, not my will, but thy will be done. You know, the Apostle Paul asked the Lord to alleviate the thorn that he suffered from, but ultimately he submitted to God's desire to make his power perfect in Paul's weakness. And then, of course, the great formula for achieving peace found in Isaiah chapter 26, verses 3 and 4 and 12. And the only reason I know that is because I've been teaching that at my local church here. It all comes down to acknowledging that you are not in control. God is in control. And so the Christian would say that a lot of suffering comes out of human beings simply wanting to play God and not let God be God, which is a denial of reality, ultimately. So that internal mental processing of coming to that place of submission to God's control of the world is definitely important. And I can affirm, I'm going to reframe it a bit, but I can affirm what Harris is saying. But that's the only thing that Harris is saying, okay? As if the only thing you need to do is look inward and rearrange the furniture of your mind. And so now we're back to the difference between Harris's starting point and the Christians.
There are two experiences people tend to have when they have sought out a peak experience like that. If they're lucky, they really have something like a moment where they're lifted out of themselves and they can just have something like this breathtaking encounter with nature, right? And then all too often that lasts, a second and a half, and then they're just talking about it and thinking about it and trying to get back to it, but they're still just jabbering to themselves.
It's so interesting to hear this conversation, and I encourage you to go back and watch the full thing. I mean, obviously I'm looking at clips here, some of the highlights in my opinion of what this is, but and sort of talking about it. But you got to listen to the whole conversation. I think it's like 2 hours or something. It's definitely worth your time just to think about what they're saying. Because even here, Sam Harris is talking about having a breathtaking encounter, but the question is, with what? With what is he having a breathtaking encounter? He says nature, but is that all that there is, right? It's just so interesting, this exercise in having a super precise and technical conversation that can never zoom out and see the forest for the trees, in my opinion, because that's what's going on here. There are so many things that Harris and Peterson are talking about that the Christian absolutely affirms and acknowledges. Why? Because the human person in the Christian worldview is an ensouled, embodied creature. We are both body and spirit. The Christian, and a lot of religious folks, agrees with what Paul Gould says when he says the whole world is haunted, right? It's haunted by a spiritual dimension that is deeper than matter, and it's deeper than materiality. That is the best explanation for the way things are. So to say that everything must be explained molecularly, it's far too reductionistic, and it misses the forest for the trees. So, any conversation about the physiological effects of the body, it's great, okay? Because we can understand more and more about the body's functions, especially in light of these topics like suffering, sensing awe, etc. But to only focus on the body and try to use the body to explain what is happening on the spiritual side of things is a huge mistake. And I'm not sure what is going on with Peterson, but that is ultimately missing from this conversation. And it's the immaterial realm. If you don't allow for the immaterial realm, this is what conversations can look like.
There's so much resonance between what I think is true and the kinds of things Jesus said, right? My issue with organized religion, every organized religion, is just that clearly what we're really talking about are deeper universal truths about the nature of mind, right? Maybe, whether we limit it to human minds or just mind itself.
Okay, there it is again, right? Harris's starting point is there is no such thing as an immaterial realm. There is no such thing as a soul. There is no such thing as God. That's what he begins with in order to then make sense of the Bible. Well, if that's your starting point, then it makes total sense what he's saying. Okay, I could totally agree with what he's saying if I agree with his starting point. If he's correct in his starting point, the Bible and all ancient religious texts are simply an exercise in revealing the psychological development of humanity, right?
And so there's no culture, there's no religion, there's no provincial cult that has the full story, and really the burden on us in every present generation, but certainly now in the 21st century, where there are all the barriers to
universalization,
all the barriers to getting information and translating from other languages, all of that's broken down. We have access to everyone's ideas, right? There've been 100 billion people, and a bunch of them have had good ideas, a bunch of them have had bad ideas, and we have access to thousands of years of human conversation.
So,
and so my only argument,
sort out what those ideas were.
My only argument is that we should only care about using the best ideas. And we no longer have the right to any deep, serious sectarianism. Right now, that's not to say that you can't be especially taken with Jesus and the tradition that has grown up around him, and you're kind of bored with Socrates, and so you don't spend as much time with him, and that's all fine. But the problem I've had traditionally with organized religion is religion historically is the only corner of culture where people begin saying to themselves and to their children, we're playing a totally different game over here. This is not a matter of just ideas and human beings and human conversations and ordinary books. No, these books were written by God or inspired by God, and they can't be edited. And it seems to me that the danger in that, I'm not disagreeing with you.
As a product of post-Enlightenment thought, which I think Harris is, Harris would never survive pre-Enlightenment, like the medieval period or before that.
Danger in that is that it actually minimizes the problem of atrocity that's associated with sectarianism, because, and perhaps you're not.
No, I'll agree with you. You can heap as many atrocities as you want on that side of the balance. I will agree with you.
Well, okay, so this is what I'm pointing to, though, because we're having a discussion in some ways about sacred things, and then we're talking about the issue of religion, and so there's a couple of things I want to say about that.
Well, hold on a second. I hate to keep jumping in. I'm sorry, but I take it Peterson won't clarify what he just said, right? But I think it's important. I think what he was saying there was, if you have a text that cannot be altered, right? If that's what Harris's problem is here, that the sacred text cannot be altered. But if you have a text that cannot be altered, that kind of does safeguard against tyrants and other types of evil folks to come in and alter the text to justify committing atrocities against other human beings. So if you say the Bible is the word of God, and so therefore the established attitude is we cannot alter God's words, then even if a tyrant wanted to come in and do certain things and justify it by changing the Bible, they wouldn't be able to. Now, that doesn't seem to stop people from trying to interpret the Bible in advantageous ways, but it minimizes potential atrocity. I think that's what Peterson is getting at.
Dostoevsky had it right to some degree in The Grand Inquisitor. Because do you remember that story, The Grand Inquisitor?
Yeah,
okay.
I'm it's been many, several decades since I actually read the book. But yeah.
Well, the remarkable thing about that story is Christ comes back to earth, and he does some miracles. And it's the church himself that puts him in jail. And then the head of the church comes to the jail and says, what the hell are you doing back here? The last thing we need is you. We've got everything sorted out. We know what's going on. It's like, we're going to put you to death tomorrow. And then Christ kisses him on the lips, and the Grand Inquisitor turns white. And then when he leaves, the Grand Inquisitor, he leaves the door open. And that's so brilliant. And, Dostoevsky was writing at the same time as Nietzsche and had quite an influence on Nietzsche, as it turned out. But because Dostoevsky was writing fiction, he could go places that Dostoevsky couldn't go as a philosopher. And one of the things he was trying to point out was that despite the proclivity to totalitarianism that you can lay at the feet of sectarian religion, the door is left open. And, all of us have to come to terms with the fact that our institutions, religious and otherwise, tend to ossify into these totalitarian structures that are analogous socially, I think, in some ways to the default network that you just described. They're trying to point to something beyond that, but, they degenerate and ossify. And then But then we have to go underneath that too if we're going to get our criticisms right, because as terrified as it's reasonable to be about religious sectarianism and totalitarianism, it's also necessary to remember that chimpanzees go on raiding parties.
Right.
Yeah.
And kill the neighboring tribe, so to speak, and they're not motivated by religious concerns. And so,
yeah, I mean, this is the point that Peterson brought up when he talked to Harris before in Vancouver or wherever that was. Like, if Harris's concern is that there is some kind of inherent feature that leads to human atrocity, the question is that feature of creatures or of religion? And so Peterson bringing up the chimpanzee thing is simply to suggest it's not a feature of religion. This is how human beings, in the pursuit of their own glorification, ruin religion.
To put that at the feet of religion, even implicitly, I think I understand why that's an impulse, but it doesn't face the problem deeply enough. And it also obscures a potential solution, I think, because it tends to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I know you're trying to regain the baby.
Yeah, no, I'm
That's
trying to save the
obvious.
baby. Yeah.
Yes.
No, I love that baby.
Yeah, I love that baby too. Again, Peterson's baby is religion, right? It is Christianity. And so this is just a very highbrow exercise in challenging Harris's contention that the problem is religion. The problem is not religion. The problem is people. See, if you just hold these two categories in mind very clearly, and then you go back into history and try to use those two categories as like explanatory grids to make sense of those events in history, one grid has way greater explanatory power than the other. Okay? We are the problem. And our base natures infect everything, including our pursuit of God. That's a true statement. Which, by the way, pointing that out says nothing about whether or not God exists at all. It just shows that at the end of the day, humanity very often sucks.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the crucial variables that make religion itself so problematic are, one, the religions, and this is true of the Abrahamic ones in particular, the religions that are focused on a text, right, that can't be edited. Now, religious moderates and religious liberals will disagree with me, and they'll say that the whole tradition is a matter of, reinterpreting and grappling with the contradictions and and that's all a very rich discourse and blah blah blah. But the real problem is the books themselves betray their merely human origin on almost every page. There's just it's true of the plays of Shakespeare. It's true of the Iliad and the Odyssey. It's true of Virgil. It's true of Dostoevsky, and it's true of the Bible, right? In all its parts, right? So if you just imagine how good a book could be, if it were truly written or dictated by an omniscient being. I mean, it's trivially easy to imagine that these would be so much better than they in fact are.
It's really not that easy to translate the sorts of experiences that you're pointing to into words.
I know.
Right?
No, but you can do it better and worse.
Okay. Let's talk about that for a minute. Better.
I got it. Look, Harris completely sidesteps Peterson and just picks back up his original claim, which is the problem is the sacred text can't be edited, okay? I really do think that is not a great answer to the real problem that I think Harris is trying to pinpoint, which is man's inhumanity to man, maybe if I can characterize it that way. The lowly behaviorism of our creatureliness that we find in the history of some religious expression. Like, you would have to do a lot more work to say, well, the problem is the sacred text can't be edited, than to just simply say that. I mean, I suppose Harris means that they should be edited in order to reflect new and more enlightened ways of thinking as humanity evolved over time or something. I mean, just again, to me, this is a very sophomoric response to the problems with humanity. And I think it betrays an underlying chronological snobbery on the part of Harris, which is to say that, all those people in the past were idiots and we're better than they are because we understand more than they did, right? With regard to the Bible in all its parts, as was his quote, right? That is his attitude. I challenge you to read just about anybody that comprises the great works of our history, the canon of our Western society, those who wrote things down as a snapshot of their particular moment in time. And Harris brought up some of these people, you know, Shakespeare, Dante, Dostoevsky, you know, maybe I can add like Augustine or Aquinas, right? Look at what they were saying and writing and ask yourself, are we as a people now smarter than these people were then? Is it really that simple to suggest? Of course it's not. And guess what all these individuals stood on top of in order to inform and shape their own beliefs and writings? The Bible. Look, I love conversations like these, all right? In one sense, because it provides us the opportunity to, you know, be a fly on the wall when the greatest of minds can get together to chat. You know, maybe before the internet, maybe before YouTube, these kinds of conversations would be happening back in like the lounge or something at a university where the professors get together between classes, you know what I mean? And now we get to be in on these kinds of conversations. It's great. And even if you disagree with some of the things that you heard, there's no question that Peterson and Harris, their credentials in the area of the mind are stellar. All right. So a lot of this is just super fascinating and interesting. And I actually agree with a lot of what was said. But the real issue that I have with this conversation comes down to really two things. Number one, Harris begins with a very specific starting point that is never identified completely. And it is never really questioned. You know, a lot of what he says does cohere together as a framework of understanding the world. The problem is that what this framework stands on top of, that's where a lot of the mistakes and the errors creep in. And this is absolutely what needs to be questioned. The things that are taken for granted, that are axiomatic, okay? Because if not, then Harris gets to wax eloquent about lots of things that do cohere if and only if you accept his particular starting point. And one of his starting points is, or it seems to be, materialism is true and immaterialism is false. If you don't get that straight and you don't question that and get squared away on that, you'll have a 2-hour conversation about things that both materialism and immaterialism can explain from their particular frameworks and never solve the issue of which view is actually true and which one is actually false. You see that, right? And the other thing is, Peterson should have been more direct in his challenges to Harris, all right? Even though Peterson is probably not 100% in the Christian camp from what I've heard him say previously. I mean, he's certainly a lot more friendly to Christianity than Harris is. So he could have been more challenging in some of the things that Harris said. And, you know, you get into the weeds of style here a bit, right? Like, I'm sure Peterson wants to take some time to affirm Harris in order to maintain a strong rapport. But on the other hand, it's very clear that there already is such a strong rapport. So it's actually okay to challenge more. The best reception that people have to challenges come from their good friends. Okay, remember that. There are just tons of leading questions to ask your friend that can directly challenge the flaws and assumptions that they make, but still maintain the bond of friendship. It's really a lot easier than you think. Well, I hope this exercise blessed you in some sense. What did you think of this exchange? How would you have responded to Harris, or how would you have responded to Peterson during this conversation? A lot of claims were made, a lot of things were said. Where are you in this? Let's keep the conversation alive in the comments below. I would love to hear what you are thinking through yourself in these particular areas. As always, I will return soon with more videos, but in the meantime, I will say bye for now.